what you started to say a couple of minutes ago about the importance of us recognising trauma for ourselves.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned, and I've been a therapist for a number of years, and I'm only just beginning to recognise why I resonate with certain trauma stories, and why other stories, regardless of how traumatic they sound or regardless of how upsetting they can be to the people who tell it to me, I feel unaffected by it in some way. I feel sad for that person, or I feel a level of emotion for that person, but for me personally, I don't feel affected by it. And yet other stories, which perhaps aren't as horrific or don't sound perhaps as traumatic when you first hear them, I'm left with real strong feelings of having touched upon my own trauma. Yeah. And it took me a really long time to understand why that might be. And sometimes you think, well, is it the frequency of the stories? Is it, the fact that I can identify that story? And I'm now beginning to realise that it's none of those things. And it's something about something I connect with, which I think is something within me. And that's why I get affected by that story. And that's when my own trauma gets stimulated. Yes. And that's taken me a long time and a lot of therapy and a lot of reading and understanding. And I know when I speak to other therapists, they say, well, I haven't recognised that in me. I don't know what triggers it for me either. And I think it's really important that we begin to think about our triggers.
Does that mean that even though we do such a lot of self-awareness work as part of our jobs, and for our own interest, presumably, that there's still something about our own trauma and our relationship with it that we don't easily get to, even as therapists?
Yeah, I do. I think for me, it still takes me by surprise. And it seems to be very different stories trigger it, or very different client work triggers it, and it still takes me by surprise. And I've done a lot of work, and I've thought really hard about my own trauma stories, and still I get taken by surprise at the things that resonate with me and triggers for me. And I think there's a real difference in the training between when we're trained as counsellors and we talk about empathy and putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and recognising the stories from their perspective, and resonating, sitting there and thinking, something's connecting here with me. And it's not empathy, it's not empathic, it's about me, and it's about what's going on for me. And there's something in that story that has triggered my own, somatic markers. I feel shaky, I feel re-traumatized, I feel all of those feelings. Yeah. And I'm taken by surprise again by them. So there's something, I think, that I haven't learned, and I don't know if other therapists learn, about vicarious trauma and what happens with vicarious trauma, and why it happens with some stories and why it doesn't happen with others.
Yes. And what to do about it when it does happen.
Yeah, and how to recognise the theme, and that's what I'm beginning to notice, that it's a real deep value thing within me that is re-traumatized. My values are being violated, and that's what it is. It's not about the content of the story, but the thread or the theme is something about a violation of a value, and that's why the stories I'm affected by seem to be so different. Wow. But contain this theme, be it, something to do with my connection at the moment with the Jewishness in me, and returning to Israel, where I was, the first time I recognized this was when I went to the Jewish Museum and walked around it, and the trauma I felt was like nothing else I'd ever felt, and yet it wasn't about other Jewish people, it was something about, this is my history and I'm feeling it on such a emotional level, you know, as opposed to this is about the story of the Jews. It felt like, you know, it was, and that's how I began to notice these things. It felt really important.
Yes. And could you say something about how those insights are coming into your work more? What I don't know if that links with your work around definitional ceremony, or if there's something different that you would say about that.
I think how it's really showing itself in its work at the moment is I've worked with a client recently diagnosed with PTSD, and the way I've worked with that client has been very, very different in using the things that I'm feeling, the resonances, in a really powerful way. So I'm feeling it, and instead of kind of sharing it as empathy belonging to the client, I am sharing that actually this is making me feel this way, and I'm wondering if it's making me feel this way, what is it? How is it manifesting for you? And that kind of thing, as opposed to in the past I may have just empathically felt it and not actually owned it or talked about how it was making me feel on a actual in the moment feeling.
Yeah.
And in the definitional ceremonies, what we've done is when we've talked about researching a certain subject, at the moment we used it in looking at black and minority ethnic students, how to attract them within our postgraduate course, because we don't seem to attract them, and we wanted to find out what that might be. So we asked some people from different cultural backgrounds to come and do a definitional ceremony where they talked about the reason why they wouldn't have come to the university to study on this particular course. And we asked people, we handed out a sheet of questions asking people what do they think about, what are they feeling when they're listening to these stories. And then they came back to us with their responses. And amazing things came out about, you know, people saying that they began to link with Clifton being part of the slave trade.
Right.
And therefore they began to recognise things within themselves, that the reason they didn't want to come and study, one of the reasons they didn't want to come and study in Bristol was because of the relationship with the slave trade. Well, that had never even entered my head, and I don't think, had we not told our individual stories, I don't think that would have ever come out. I couldn't think of how you could have asked that question if it wasn't even in your mind. So it's amazing stories come back where people say, when I listened to that story, this resonated for me, or I felt this, or they're able to tell links to their own trauma values that it might have been triggered. You know, we had a student who's been on our course for 2 years, attended personal development group for 2 years, and in that definitional ceremony, she told a trauma story that she'd never shared on the 2 years, but she said she felt that she could, because there was something about the sharing of these stories
Yes.
to resonate with.
Yes.